Shout out sa buong mundo at shout out sa buong Pilipinas. Ang bansang ito, binago ng Diyos. Ito ang Sion. Sion ang bansang ito. Bakit? Dumating na ang Diyos eh. Yun ang kanyang hatol. Kasi ang Pilipinas, binago ni Haring Pilipi sa pamamagitan ng pagtawid dito ni Magdilan. Ngunit sa pagdating ng Diyos sa huling araw, sa panahon ito, ay binalik ang pangalan yun. Mayroong ginawang 3 tanggulan, ang sinasabi Luzon, Visayas at Mindanao. Ngunit sa huling araw, sa paghatol ng Diyos, binago. Kasi nasusulat naman doon sa Apokalipsis 21:5. Sa pagdating niya, pag-upo sa kanyang paghahari sa huling araw, babaguhin ang lahat ng bagay. Ngayon, ang Luzon, Visayas at Mindanao, tinawag ng Diyos na ang Luzon, bagong Jerusalem, ang Mindanao, bagong Israel, ang Bisaya, bagong Bethlehem. Yun ang pagbabago ng Diyos. Kaya shout out sa buong mundo at higit sa lahat sa Diyos na makapangyarihan sa lahat, ang Ama at ang Anak at ang Espiritu Santo. Ang tatlo nagkakaisa sa panalita sa buong mundo sa kanyang paghatol. Ngayon, ang pamagat ng mensaheng ito, sinasabi, may watawat ang Diyos na buhay, pangbuong mundo. Pangbuong mundo ang watawat ng Diyos na buhay. Nandiyan naman, inilagay ko ang katibayan, ang sitas. Ngayon, sapagkat may ipaparinig tayo na programa ng Diyos sa buong mundo. Sapagkat sa paghatol ng Diyos sa panahon ito, ang mga bansa nagkakagulo. Bakit? Ay ang sumasaway nasa Pilipinas ay dapat dinggin. Nandito sa bansang ito, Pilipinas, nandito ang watawat na Pangbuong. Kaya ipaparinig natin ang nangyayari sa Israel at sa iba't ibang dako ng buong mundo. Sapagkat ang Israel, bago na. Ang luma, siyempre, linuma na. Kasi sa huling araw, babaguhin nga. Ay, ito na ang katuparan. Kaya magpaparinig tayo ng isang programa na nagsasalita dito ang isang tagapagbalita pambuong mundo. Pinapaliwanag niya yung nangyayari sa buong mundo. Dahil nagkakaroon na yun ng kaguluhan. Ngunit kung makinig naman ang mga hari sa buong mundo, mawawala ang kaguluhan kung makinig sa Diyos na buhay. Anong paparinig natin?
Imagine spending more than a year planning a stunning attack, with the goal of making a key third party angry with the target, succeeding in doing that, and then having it all backfire. Sound strange? Let me explain. The cliche that the enemy of my enemy is my friend is alive and well in the Middle East, though today it comes with an extra layer of complication. Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and, by proxy, Hamas, are currently engaged in a great game over political survival and regional control. In the immediate aftermath of Hamas's October 7th attack on Israel, a leading explanation for its cause was that Hamas wanted to drive a wedge between Israel and Saudi Arabia, who appeared to be close to agreeing to normalize relations. Today, however, we are going to examine the possibility that Hamas's plan may ultimately backfire. And all of this is due to the intricate web of Israeli domestic politics. The full story, of course, is a complicated puzzle, which is why we will cover it in 6 steps. First, we will delve into another complicated web, this time Middle East political alignments. Then we will discuss how a potential accord between Israel and Saudi Arabia threatened to upend the situation, and what was holding up that deal. Afterward, we will cover how Hamas may have used the October 7th attack as a preventive war of sorts, the long-term plan for Hamas coming out of it, and finally, the key twist that may cause the plan to come crashing down like a house of cards. But we begin with the political structure of the Middle East. Iran is the first domino here. The 1979 revolution gave rise to the modern Iranian state, and with it, a fight for acknowledgement as the head of the table of the Islamic world. Staring across the Persian Gulf was its chief rival, Saudi Arabia. This is not just a battle of Sunni versus Shia Muslims, monarchy versus theocratic governance, or tolerating the United States versus death to America. It is also that Saudi Arabia controls Mecca and Medina, the 2 holiest cities in Islam. Indeed, over the decades, there have been various different bans, quotas, and boycotts. Not a good place to be when the Hajj pilgrimage is supposed to be a mandatory religious duty. Control of Holy Lands also put Iran in direct conflict with Israel, though distant geography meant that Iran took a back seat to the Arab states for the last 8 decades of conflict there. And as a practical matter, despite Tehran's lofty ambitions, neither Israel nor Saudi Arabia face any serious threat from Iran. Looking at military expenditures, Saudi Arabia ranks 5th in the world at $75 billion annually, and Israel comes in 15th at $23.4 billion. Meanwhile, Iran is all the way down at 34th and $6.8 billion. By comparison, both Qatar, 20th, $15.4 billion, and Kuwait, 30th, $8.2 billion, are regional actors that outpace Iran, and even Oman is close by at 36th and $5.8 billion. Moreover, those numbers do not account for how the United States, who supports both Saudi Arabia and Israel, dwarfs the rest of the world with $877 billion in spending. Also, the next time someone tells you that economic sanctions do not do anything, well, first refer them to our recent deep dive on that. But second, point them to this low number, which is a direct product of Iran losing out on the revenue from trade flows. But there is a big difference between not fearing Iranian flags rising in your capitals and actually feeling safe at home. Lower level conflicts can extract their own toll and always risk boiling over into something bigger. Just ask Ukraine how it feels about Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk with almost a decade of retrospect. For Saudi Arabia, these problems are both inside and all around. Inside, the 2019 drone attacks on Saudi oil processing facilities served as a wake-up call for the damage that Iran could inflict at relatively low direct cost. The deal that China mediated in March 2023 perhaps alleviated fears of any near-term repeats of that. But no one was under the impression that this was the end of hostilities. The all-around part is the evidence of that. The headline issue there is the civil war in Yemen, where rebels with alleged Iranian support aim to control the western edge of the country. This just so happens to be both a key choke point for oil transports between the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, and also next to a pocket of Shia minorities who live across the border in Saudi Arabia. If you remember hearing about Yemeni rebels recently targeting boats, this is the location. But there are also problems to the east, with Iran's ability to manipulate the Strait of Hormuz, another oil choke point, this time between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. Meanwhile, to the north in Iraq, there is growing Iranian-backed anti-Saudi influence, thanks to the vacuum created when the United States removed Saddam Hussein from power 2 decades ago. Switching gears, for the sake of brevity, Israel's problems are mercifully simpler to boil down to proxies that Netanyahu is perfectly happy to point you toward. Iranian partners to the north in Syria and in Lebanon. That takes us to the budding relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and a throwback to the enemy of my enemy is my friend logic. On the surface, the idea is simple. Saudi Arabia does not particularly like Israel either, much for the same reasons as Iran. But Iran represents the bigger threat. Israel has no desire to invade Saudi territory, but Iran sees some upside. If Israel and Saudi Arabia could establish a working relationship, they could use their joint efforts to exert greater force against Iran. For example, one of the key problems that Israel faced with Iran's nuclear program was geography. Flashback to 1981. Disco was dead, but the Iran-Iraq war was in full swing, and so was the enemy of my enemy logic once again. France was in the process of helping Iraq build a nuclear facility on the outskirts of Baghdad. Iran tried and failed to destroy it, and resorted to forwarding its intelligence to Israel. But for Israel, the holdup was geography. It is a long way to the outskirts of Baghdad. The solution was to send its jets zooming through Saudi Arabia, featuring an elaborate plan to pretend to be lost and confused Jordanian pilots, replicating that successfully over a much greater distance, and twice because this is a round trip, and likely with multiple teams to hit multiple sites, was a much more difficult task. But if Saudi airspace were open to Israeli pilots, well, that is a different story. Now, remember, those are the surface incentives. Below the surface, it isn't cute dolphins, much as we might want it to be. It is more cold-blooded geopolitics. There are concerns about what the United States will be doing over the next decade. The Persian Gulf was, once upon a time, the linchpin to energy security. But the United States is the world's largest oil producer, and appears set to become a net exporter of oil sooner than later, if it is not already. That does not make the Persian Gulf irrelevant for U.S. interests. Production there is still key to keeping global prices low and world trade free-flowing. It is just that the United States no longer views it as important as before. Then there are the American scars from the adventurous foreign policy under George W. Bush. Democrats were the original source of that reluctance. But now there is a growing isolationist push in the Trump-era Republican Party. That is the short version of why Ukraine aid has been so slow as of late. But history on this goes back further. Following the 2019 refinery attack, Washington sent its well wishes, but did not coordinate with Riyadh on a serious response. All of that is a complicated way of saying that Saudi Arabia would like to find a friend elsewhere. And given the regional military breakdown from earlier, Israel looks like an attractive candidate. Moreover, animosity between Saudi Arabia and Iran runs both ways. Each capital would like to see significant changes in the other's country. Meanwhile, with Israel, Saudi Arabia sees a beneficial asymmetry. Riyadh would like to make major changes around Jerusalem, but Israel does not care much about Saudi Arabia, as long as they stay away from the Mediterranean. In contrast, there is no plausible world where Israeli soldiers undertake a literal march on Riyadh. In that regard, Israel is less threatening to Saudi Arabia than Iran. Even better, while the United States has slowly started saying goodbye to some of its interests in the Middle East, Israel is the one place where it seems to just carry on. Joining up with Israel would therefore encourage the United States to perhaps stick around. But as is seemingly the case with any good thing, there was a holdup. Regardless of how beneficial Saudi Arabia connecting with Israel would be on the geopolitical chessboard, your average Saudi Arabian would not have been too enthusiastic about it. Yes, Saudi Arabia is an autocracy, but a recurring theme of this channel is that life is a lot easier for an autocrat when your people like you than when they hate you. Israel needed to throw in something to sweeten the pot for Saudi Arabia, especially after the geopolitical blowback from moving the capital from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. This is where Israel's demographics and domestic politics started to get in the way. In a world where one person equals one vote, democratic elections favor those who make babies. Israel's fertility rate is about 3 per woman, which is exceptionally high for a developed country. However, fertility in Israel falls disproportionately into the ultra-Orthodox camp, with an astounding rate of 6.6. They, in turn, lean right-wing politically. This became plainly evident following the most recent Israeli parliamentary elections. Netanyahu's Likud party won the most seats, and thus was tasked with forming a government. But the seats started drifting to the right, and Netanyahu chose to ally with ultra-nationalists to secure the prime minister's slot. That, in turn, led to more aggressive settlement policies in the West Bank, essentially the opposite of what was necessary to seal the Saudi deal. Ending the settlements risked losing the support of his governing coalition, and thus the end of his government. And it is not like this is a foreign concept there. Israel, a state 8 years younger those problems. This was still not a, and with that came a preventive